Our story this week shifts to Egypt, and this will be where the Bible keeps us for basically the rest of the book of Genesis and the first portion of the book of Exodus. Basically, our Sunday school year this fall. We are now in the geographical location where it's all going to go down in the nation of Egypt, which is a particularly rich nation at this point in the world's history. They are a somewhat advanced society compared to some of the other societies around them. I actually had a class a little more than a year ago specifically on the book of Exodus. I had to spend a lot of time studying some things about the nation of Egypt. Not real great with like geography. I'm pretty good with history and stuff like that, but geography and trying to remember, where various landmarks, mountains, valleys. I had to get into all that stuff. But the most important thing for anyone casually studying Egypt to know, the Nile River. That's in one reason why Egypt became such a powerful, prominent nation. The Nile River would come and basically make this real fertile area in the land on either side of the Nile. Stuff would just grow. In other places in the Middle East, not so much. A lot of desert land in places not too far from the Nile River. But it led to this flourishing society down in Egypt, really wealthy and powerful people. And it is into this society that this humble young man who has been rejected by his brothers and sold by slave traders finds himself now living. What a jarring identity crisis for a kid growing up and under the household of his father Jacob in the Middle East, and now a completely different land, completely different gods that the people down there worship, completely different language it's spoken, completely different style of dress, just a whole different culture that he finds himself in. And he's living in, well, I mentioned there's a lot of people who benefited from the wealth of Egypt, and one of those is a guy named Potiphar. And so Joseph finds himself sold to Potiphar. Quite common in old ancient days for people to be sold into slavery. Not necessarily the same kind of ethnic connotations. Obviously, we have a very sad history of slavery in America. In the ancient world, it wasn't necessarily about inferiority of race or anything like that. That people didn't necessarily think because Joseph wasn't an Egyptian that's what made him quality to be a slave. It was just he was available labor, and you can get a sense that there was no real inherent prejudice against Joseph based on the prominence that he was given in the household of Potiphar. Basically, it was a meritocracy, which means that if you, it's based on merit. If you do good, you are rewarded for doing good. And Joseph was a real good household manager. I'm sure that originally he had some very small tasks to do, and when he did those well, he was promoted to doing more work. And sometimes this goes, maybe some of you can relate to this. If you have a job where you do a good job, you're like, oh, I'm going to give you more to do then. In Joseph's case, it wasn't just necessarily more labor, it was actually having a supervisory capacity. And it gets to the point where Potiphar's like, oh, this guy's great. I'm just going to enjoy my life and let him run the show. And Joseph is now bossing other people around, and not in a mean way, but he's just very good at managing a household, at figuring out what needs to be done, which is really kind of striking when you think about the fact that he's not from Egypt. He quickly catches on to how things are supposed to be done down in Egypt and how to manage a household in a completely different part of the world. And so things are going, all things considered, pretty well. I'm sure it's not easy, leaving the life behind that he did, missing his father, may or may not be missing his brothers at this point, but he does the best he can where he is before the next problem comes in his life. I mean, this guy's already been through enough trauma with his brothers, uh, arguing about or trying to decide should we kill him. Finally, they just sell him into slavery. So he's already been through a lot of trauma, but now we've got this situation with this woman who's trying to seduce him. Should be noted here, Joseph is and the text actually says Joseph is a young, handsome man. He's single himself. He's got no companionship. it would seem to be a situation that a man could easily fall into sin in this situation. But Joseph resists. When this woman is throwing herself at him, Joseph says, "No, I can't do this." And she then becomes humiliated, enraged, and essentially frames Joseph and with the accusation that he was trying to seduce her. Now, depending on the age group that you're teaching, I think your materials will do a good job helping you here. In your own sense, I think you guys have kids yourselves and know how to, or perhaps if your kids are my age, you haven't really thought through like, okay, when do I really get into talking about Sixth Commandment issues? But use wisdom and discernment as befitting your age. Certainly, if you're teaching an older class, that this is not anything they haven't heard before. The idea that there's men and women who are attracted to one another. So whatever the age group you're on, just kind of keep it at the best level for that age group to discuss Sixth Commandment issues. So it ends up then that Joseph is accused and in fact convicted. Not much of a justice system, and I guess here's where we do see the downfall of being a slave, because when it's her word against his word, and this is a sketchy thing today too, right? When you got an accusation being made and you just have one person's word against somebody else's, real tough situations to know, what to do and who's telling the truth. In this case, she actually has some evidence, right? I have his cloak here. How ironic in that case. Poor Joseph, he's just bad luck with cloaks and clothing. My goodness. So he's convicted and sent to prison. Now, it's at this point that you kind of, if you put yourself in someone's situation in here and say, how would I feel at this point? You're doing the right thing, and you literally are punished for it. How messed up is that? Now, think about the possibilities for suffering. What are some reasons people suffer? Well, sometimes people suffer because they make bad choices in life, right? If I decide to drink a 12-pack and then go driving and I end up crashing my car, that's on me, right? You make a stupid decision, sinful decision, and you may suffer the consequences. Sometimes stuff just happens because you live in a fallen world. You get a disease. That's not because you sinned. You didn't do anything virtuous or sinful. You just happen to suffer for it. But then there's the third category, which is way harder, I think, than the other two. And that's where you do good and suffer not in spite of doing good, but because you do good. If Joseph had given in to this woman's demands, her seduction, he probably isn't in jail, right? She probably doesn't falsely accuse him then. And they probably would have got away with it. He's managing the household. Potiphar seems to be off all the time doing his thing, having a good time in his life. But it's precisely because Joseph has done the right thing that he suffers for it. But what do we tell our Sunday school kids? Do the right thing and things will turn out for you, right? Do the right thing and you will be rewarded. You know what? In the short term, you do the right thing and sometimes it's going to bite you doing the right thing. There's that old cliche, no good deed goes unpunished. There is some truth to that. Joseph does a good deed, and he is punished. And he ends up in jail, and he pouts, and he whines in jail. No, he doesn't. That's the amazing thing to me about this story. What does Joseph do in jail? He rolls up his sleeves. I don't know if he still has any sleeves at this point in his life, but all right, what do you need me for here? Like, seriously? Yeah, the same approach he took to working in Potiphar's house. You need anything done around here? Let me go to work. And he ends up running the jail. Isn't this amazing stuff? You're like, oh, this guy's pretty good. Let's put him in charge of the jail. And he doesn't get out of the jail. He's still stuck in the jail, but might as well make the most of where you are, right? Absolutely mind-boggling. Absolutely stunning. How do you attribute this in Joseph? Well, he just must be a good egg, right? Now, Joseph knows his Lord. How does he know his Lord? Well, we know Jacob would have taught him about the one true God. But here's really a really interesting kind of part of the text you may not notice in the first reading. When Joseph is trying to talk to this woman who's seducing him, he says, I can't do this. My master Potiphar's put me in charge of this. I I can't treat my master this way by taking you from him. But also, I cannot sin against God. Joseph knows if he were to go to bed with this woman, he would be sinning against the Lord. You know what's really fascinating about that? Exodus 20 hasn't happened yet. What's Exodus 20? That's when Moses gets the 10 Commandments, including 6th commandment. There is nothing written down anywhere that adultery is forbidden by God, at least that we know of at this point in history. But Joseph knows the law of God is written on our hearts. His father, perhaps his grandfather, has taught him about the one true God and what he expects of us. And Joseph is holding on to that. Joseph knows who he belongs to. Now, this is still rather stunning in spite of the misfortune he's had. It's really easy for someone suffering misfortune to look around and say, well, God must not love me, right? Well, this is what I get for serving God. I'm done. Joseph hangs on to his identity as one of God's chosen people, and he continues to live in light of that identity, even amidst great adversity. Even when he suffers because of his identity, he continues to live as a child of God. Whether he's in a Potiphar's house, whether he's in jail, it actually, I had that irrelevant sermon series over the summer. This is irrelevant. Where you live, what suffering you've had, that doesn't change anything. So Joseph continues to hold on to his identity and serve the Lord. Some of your materials, I know, get into doctrine of vocation. You may remember a couple of years ago, we spent a long time at Zion, for those who were here a couple of years ago, talking doctrine of vocation. Joseph gets vocation. My vocation is a slave in Potiphar's house. I'm going to work hard in Potiphar's house. My vocation's in a prison. I'm going to work. Vocation of prisoner. And the guy is working hard, serving the Lord in a prison. Just unbelievable, but yet believable. When you have God in your life, all things are possible. Let's talk about our areas of emphasis. Where's Jesus in the story? Well, again, we see Joseph suffering like Jesus suffered. Last week, we talked about some of the common things between Joseph's suffering and the passion of Christ. Another commonality this week that we didn't necessarily have last week, the false accusation. When Jesus was put on trial, people flat out lied about him. And this is what Joseph has in his life here. This woman flat out lies about him, accuses him of doing evil when he has done nothing but good. This is exactly what will happen to Jesus in a couple thousand years. People will accuse him of doing evil when he has done nothing but good. And the verdict will pronounce him guilty even though he is innocent. So another commonality between Joseph and Jesus. What does this story tell us about God's mercy? Yeah, again, like last week, this is a little hard to see God's mercy. Really hard to see God's mercy here. Really got to keep reading the chapters to come to see God's mercy. But in this particular case, Joseph, you got to think, is still hanging on to that dream that he had last week, and he's holding on in faith. God will be merciful. I will be vindicated somehow, some way. This is going to work out to the good. Romans 8, all things work to the good for those who love God. We don't have a whole lot of evidence here. We're just going to have faith here in this chapter of Genesis. What does the story tell us about who we are, our identity as God's people? Again, the way that Joseph clung to his identity and led him, even when he was tempted, to maintain his faith in God. Vocation, I think, something you can talk about with your kids too. Your identity, Joseph's identity shifts here, his earthly identity. He's a servant in the house of Potiphar. Then he's a prisoner. Two very distinct identities that he didn't have previously in his life. But wherever he finds himself, he works hard at what he's doing. Your kids have vocations as students in school. Their job is to work hard in school, do their homework, listen to their teacher. Just absolutely try their hardest in school. That's part of what it means to be a baptized child of God in your present vocation, wherever God has seen fit to put you. This is true for you too, teachers. Wherever you are in life, whatever you're doing, whatever jobs, vocations, volunteering like you do here at church, family stuff, whatever, wherever God has put you, work hard. Know that in the Lord your labor is not in vain, and you are working for God and not for men. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. You're working for God. Joseph was working for God. We are too, no matter where we are, even if it's in jail. And then finally, how do we live in light of this? Well, I guess that vocation ties into it again. Our identity and our vocation are closely linked there. Also, doing what's right, even when you suffer for it. Having trust and faith in God. That even if in the short term I suffer because I do what's right, I'm going to do what's right anyway. This is a hard thing to tell kids. It's much easier to tell them, do good because you'll get rewarded for it. But if we're honest, we got to tell them, do good and you might get punished for it. But do good anyway. And if you're secure in who you are and who your Lord is, then you can do something really hard like that, to do good, even if you get punished. And then if you do get punished for doing good, to take heart. You know that in the end you will be vindicated. We'll see Joseph vindicated starting next week. We're going to see how this was actually part of God's plan. Him being in prison ended up being a good thing. I've talked to people who have actually been sentenced to jail who said to me this was a good thing for me. What's good or bad? If something's bringing you closer to God, closer to His plan for your life, it turns out to be good. Someone who's completely healthy and completely wealthy and doing really well in life, that might not be so good for them if they're drifting from our Lord. So it's all a matter of perspective, and the story of Joseph really helps us to get a good perspective on how God works, even when it's not so easy. Also, next week, some of that background I gave you on the nation of Egypt will come into play as we encounter some shifts in the Egyptian economy. So that's coming up next week. Wonderful first day of Sunday school this week. What a blessing to have all of you as a Sunday school staff. God bless you and all the work you're doing. Great, great first day. God be with you. Oh yeah, next week, I guess I'll mention this in the email too, but we're going to do an installation during the worship services for you Sunday school teachers. Thought there's a lot going on first day, so I didn't want to do it yesterday, but coming up next week, we will install you officially during either early or late service. Also backpack blessing next week, so lots going on again. We're hitting the ground running. God bless you. We'll see you soon.